You are a ticket agent, settled in the routine of your job. From 9 to 5:30, 5 days a week, you see one face after another. There are cheerful faces, sullen faces, faces that breathe garlic, whiskey, chewing gum, toothpaste, and tobacco fumes. Old faces, young faces, dull faces, scarred faces, clear faces, plain faces, and faces so plastered with makeup that their nature can't be seen at all. They bark place names at you, or ask pleasantly about the cost of round-trip versus one-way tickets to Chicago or East Burlap. You deal with them and then you wait for the next. Then one afternoon, about 4 o'clock, a face barely visible over the edge of the marble counter looks up at you with a boy's cheerful freckled smile. You have to stand up in order to see him. You smile, and he grins at you. Among his belongings is a little leather suitcase, kid size, but not a toy. He is standing on it. Under his arm is a collection of comic books. In one small fist is the remains of a candy bar, and in the other the string of a floating balloon. Well, young man, where to? Paris? London? Maybe Mars? No, sir, comes the piping voice, Rountree. Rountree? Yes, I've heard of that metropolis, you reply. You look over his head. There aren't any other customers in line behind him, so you don't mind passing the time of day. Round trip or one way? One way, comes the quick reply. This brings you to a slow stop. He does not giggle nor prattle, nor launch into a long and involved explanation with halting, dependent clauses. This one knows what he wants and how to ask for it. Quite a little man. How old are you, young fellow? I was 5 years old yesterday. What's your name? I'm James Holden. The name does not ring any bells, because the morning newspaper is purchased for its comic strips, the bridge column, the crossword puzzle, and the latest dope on love nest slayings, peccadillos of the famous, the cheesecake photo of the inevitable actress leaving for somewhere, and the full-page photograph of the latest death on the highway debacle. You look at the picture, but you don't read the names in the caption, so you don't recognize the name, and you haven't been out of your little cage since lunchtime, and Jimmy Holden was not missing then. So you go on. So you're going to go to Rountree? Yes, sir. That costs a lot of money, young Mr. Holden. Yes, sir. Then this young man hands you an envelope. The cover says, typewritten, Ticket Clerk, Midland Railroad. A bit puzzled, you open the envelope and find a $5 bill folded in a sheet of manuscript paper. The note says, /P Ticket Clerk Midland Railroad. Dear Sir P. This will introduce my son, James Holden. As a birthday present, I am sending him for a visit to his grandparents in Rountree, and to make the adventure complete, he will travel alone. Pass the word along to keep an eye on him, but don't step in unless he gets into trouble. Ask the dining car steward to see that he eats dinner on something better than candy bars. Otherwise, he is to believe that he is making this trip completely on his own. Sincerely, Lewis Holden. P.S. Divide the change from this $5 among you as tips. L.H. And so you look down at young Mr. Holden and get a feeling of vicarious pleasure. You stamp his ticket and hand it to him with a gesture. You point out the train gate he is to go through, and you tell him that he is to sit in the third railroad car. As he leaves, you pick up the telephone and call the station master, the conductor, and since you can't get the dining car steward directly, you charge the conductor with passing the word along. Then you divide the change. Of the $2.50, you extract $1, feeling that the senior Holden is a cheapskate. You slip the other $1.50 into an envelope, ready for the conductor's hand. He'll think Holden Sr. is more of a cheapskate, and by the time he extracts his cut, the dining car steward will know that Holden Sr. is a cheapskate. But then a face appears at your window and barks, Holyoke, Massachusetts, and your normal day falls back into shape. The response of the people you tell about it varies all the way from outrage that anybody would let a kid of 5 go alone on such a dangerous mission to loud bragging that he, too, once went on such a journey, at 4.5, and didn't need a note. But Jimmy Holden is gone from your window, and you won't know for at least another day that you've been suckered by a note painstakingly typewritten, letter by letter, by a 5-year-old boy who has a most remarkable vocabulary. Jimmy's trip to Roundtree was without incident. Actually, it was easy once he had hurdled the ticket seller with his forged note and the $5 bill from the cash box in his father's desk. His error in not making it a 10 was minor. A larger tip would not have provided him with better service, because the train crew were happy to keep an eye on the adventurous youngster for his own small sake. Their mild resentment against the small tip was directed against the boy's father, not the young passenger himself. He had one problem. The train was hardly out of the station before everybody on it knew that there was a 5-year-old making a trip all by himself. Of course, he was not to be bothered, but everybody wanted to talk to him, to ask him how he was, to chatter endlessly at him. Jimmy did not want to talk. His experience in addressing adults was exasperating. That he spoke lucid English instead of baby gab did not compel a rational response. Those who heard him speak made over him with the same effusive superiority that they used in applauding a golden-haired tot in high heels and a strapless evening gown sitting on a piano and singing, "Why Was I Born?" in a piping, uncertain-toned voice. It infuriated him. So he immersed himself in his comic books. He gave his name politely every 5 minutes for the first 50 miles. He turned down offers of candy with, "Mommy says I mustn't before supper." And when dinner time came, he allowed himself to be escorted through the train by the conductor, because Jimmy knew that he couldn't handle the doors without help. The steward placed a menu in front of him, and then asked carefully, "How much money do you want to spend, young man?" Jimmy had the contents of his father's cash box pinned to the inside of his shirt, and a $5 bill folded in a snap-top purse with some change in his shirt pocket. He could add with the best of them, but he did not want any more attention than he was absolutely forced to attract. So he fished out the snap-top purse and opened it to show the steward his $5 bill. The steward relaxed. He'd had a moment of apprehension that Holden Sr. might have slipped the kid a $50 for dinner. The steward had received a quarter for his share of the original $2.50. Jimmy looked at the child's dinner menu and pointed out a plate, lamb chop and mashed potatoes. After that, dinner progressed without incident. Jimmy topped it off with a dish of ice cream. The steward made change. Jimmy watched him carefully, and then said, "Daddy says I'm supposed to give you a tip." "How much?" The steward looked down, wondering how he could explain the standard dining car tip of 15 or 20% of the bill. He took a swallow of air and picked out a quarter. "This will do nicely," he said, and went off thankful that all people do not ask waiters how much they think they deserve for the service rendered. Thus Jimmy Holden arrived in Roundtree and was observed and convoyed, but not bothered, off the train. It is deplorable that adults are not as friendly and helpful to one another as they are to children. It might make for a more pleasant world. As Jimmy walked along the station platform at Roundtree, one of his former fellow passengers walked beside him. "Where are you going, young man?" "Someone going to meet you, of course?" "No, sir," said Jimmy. "I'm supposed to take a cab." "I'm going your way, why not ride along with me?" "Sure it's all right?" "Sure thing. Come along." Jimmy never knew that this man felt good for a week after he'd done his good turn for the year. His grandfather opened the door and looked down at him in complete surprise. Why, Jimmy? What are you doing here? Who brought? His grandmother interrupted. Come in. Come in. Don't just stand there with the door open. Grandfather closed the door firmly. Grandmother knelt and folded Jimmy in her arms and crooned over him, You poor darling. You brave little fellow. Donald, she said firmly to her husband, go get a glass of warm milk and some cookies. She led Jimmy to the old-fashioned parlor and seated him on the sofa. Now, Jimmy, you relax a moment and then you can tell me what happened. Jimmy sighed and looked around. The house was old and comfortably sturdy. It gave him a sense of refuge, of having reached a safe haven at last. The house was overwarm, and there was a musty smell of overaged furniture, old leather, and the pungence of mothballs. It seemed to generate a feeling of firm stability. Even the slightly stale air, there probably hadn't been a wide-open window since the storm sashes were installed last autumn, provided a locked-in feeling that conversely meant that the world was locked out. Grandfather brought in the glass of warmed milk and a plate of cookies. He sat down and asked, What happened, Jimmy? My mother and father are. You eat your cookies and drink your milk, ordered his grandmother. We know. That Mr. Brennan sent us a telegram. It was slightly more than 24 hours since Jimmy Holden had blown out the 5 proud candles on his birthday cake and begun to open his fine presents. Now it all came back with a rush, and when it came back, nothing could stop it. Jimmy never knew how very like a little boy of 5 he sounded that night. His speech was clear enough, but his troubled mind was too full to take the time to form his headlong thoughts into proper sentences. He could not pause to collect his thoughts into any chronology, so it came out going back and forth all in a single line, punctuated only by necessary pauses for the intake of breath. He was close to tears before he was halfway through, and by the time he came to the end he stopped in a sob and broke out crying. His grandfather said, Jimmy, aren't you exaggerating? Mr. Brennan isn't that sort of a man. He is too, exploded Jimmy through his tears. I saw him. But... Donald, this is no time to start cross-examining a child. She crossed the room and lifted him onto her lap. She stroked his head and held his cheek against her shoulder. His open crying subsided into deep sobs. From somewhere she found a handkerchief and made him blow his nose once, twice, and then a deep thrice. Get me a warm washcloth, she told her husband, and with it she wiped away his tears. The warmth soothed Jimmy more. Now, she said firmly, before we go into this any more we'll have a good night's sleep. The feather bed was soft and cozy. Like protecting mother wings, it folded Jimmy into its bosom, and the warm softness drew out of Jimmy whatever remained of his stamina. Tonight he slept of weariness and exhaustion, not of the sedation given last night. Here he felt at home, and it was good. And as tomorrow's always had, tomorrow would take care of itself. Jimmy Holden's father and mother first met over an operating table, dressed in the white sterility that leaves only the eyes visible. She wielded the trephine that laid the patient's brain bare. He kept track of the patient's life by observing the squiggles on the roll of graph paper that emerged from his encephalograph. She knew nothing of the craft of the delicate instrument creator, and he knew even less of the craft of surgery. There had been a near argument during the cleaning up session after the operation. The near argument ended when they both realized that neither of them understood a word of what the other was saying. So the near argument became an animated discussion, the general meaning of which became clear. Brain surgeons should know more about the intricacies of electromechanics, and the designers of delicate, precision instrumentation should know more about the mass of human gray matter they were trying to measure. They pooled their intellects and plunged into the problem of creating an encephalograph that would record the infinitesimal irregularities that were superimposed upon the great waves. Their operation became large. they bought the old structure on top of the hill and moved in, bag and baggage. They cohabited but did not live together for almost a year. Paul Brennan finally pointed out that organized society might permit a couple of geniuses to become research hermits, but organized society still took a dim view of cohabitation without a license. Besides, such messy arrangements always cluttered up the legal clarity of chattels, titles, and estates. They married in a quiet ceremony about 2 years prior to the date that Louis Holden first identified the fine line wave shapes that went with determined ideas. When he recorded them and played them back, his brain retraced its original line of thought, and he could not even make a mental revision of the way his thoughts were arranged. For 2 years Louis and Laura Holden picked their way slowly through this field, stumped at one point for several months because the machine was strictly a personal proposition. Recorded by one of them, the playback was clear to that one, but to the other it was wild gibberish and inexplicable tangle of noise and colored shapes, odors and tastes both pleasant and nasty, and mingled sensations. It was 5 years after their marriage before they found success by engraving information in the brain by sitting, connected to the machine, and reading aloud, word for word, the information that they wanted. It went by rote, as they had learned in childhood. It was the tiresome repetition of going over and over and over the lines of a poem or the numbers of the multiplication table until the pathway was a deeply trodden furrow in the brain. Forever imprinted, it was retained until death. Knowledge is stored by rote. To accomplish this end, Louis Holden succeeded in violating all of the theories of instrumentation by developing a circuit that acted as a sort of reverberation chamber which returned the wave shape played into it back to the same terminals without interference, and this single circuit became the very heart of the Holden electromechanical educator. With success underway, the Holdens needed an intellectual guinea pig, a virgin mind, an empty storehouse to fill with knowledge. They planned a 20-year program of research, to end by handing their machine to the world complete with its product and instructions for its use and a list of pitfalls to avoid. The conception of James Quincy Holden was a most carefully planned parenthood. It was not accomplished without love or passion. Love had come quietly, locking them together physically as they had been bonded intellectually. The passion had been deliberately provoked during the proper moment of Laura Holden's cycle of ovulation. This scientific approach to procreation was no experiment, it was the foregone conclusive act to produce a component absolutely necessary for the completion of their long program of research. They happily left to nature's choice the one factor they could not control, and planned to accept an infant of either sex with equal welcome. They loved their little boy as they loved one another, rejoiced with him, despaired with him, and made their own way with success and mistake, and succeeded in bringing Jimmy to 5 years of age quite normal except for his education. Now, proficiency in brain surgery does not come at an early age, nor does worldwide fame in the field of delicate instrumentation. Jimmy's parents were over 45 on the date of his birth. Jimmy's grandparents were, then, understandably aged 78 and 81. The old couple had seen their life, and they knew it for what it was. They arose each morning and faced the day knowing that there would be no new problem, only recurrence of some problem long solved. Theirs was a comfortable routine, long gone was their spirit of adventure, the pleasant notions of trying something a new and different way. At their age, they were content to take the easiest and the simplest way of doing what they thought to be right. Furthermore, they had lived long enough to know that no equitable decision can be made by listening to only one side of any argument. While young Jimmy was polishing off a platter of scrambled eggs the following morning, Paul Brennan arrived. Jimmy's fork stopped in midair at the sound of Brennan's voice in the parlor. "You called him," he said accusingly. Grandmother Holden said, "He's your legal guardian, James." "But I can't. Now, James, your father and mother knew best." But they didn't know about Paul Brennan. "I won't go." "You must." I won't. James, said Grandmother Holden quietly, you can't stay here. Why not? We're not prepared to keep you. Why not? Grandmother Holden despaired. How could she make this youngster understand that 80 is not an age at which to embark upon the process of raising a 5-year-old to maturity? From the other room, Paul Brennan was explaining his side as he'd given it to the police. Forgot the land option that had to be signed. So I took off after them and drove fast enough to catch up. I was only a couple of 100 yards behind when it happened. He's a liar, cried Jimmy Holden. That's not a nice thing to say. It's true. Jimmy, came the reproachful tone. It's true, he cried. His grandfather and Paul Brennan came into the kitchen. Ah, Jimmy, said Paul in a soothing voice, why did you run off? You had everybody worried. You did. You lie. You. James, snapped his grandfather. Stop that talk at once. Be easy with him, Mr. Holden. He's upset. Jimmy, let's get this settled right now. What did I do and how do I lie? Oh, please, Mr. Brennan, said his grandmother. This isn't necessary. Oh, but it is. It is very important. As the legal guardian of young James, I can't have him harboring some suspicion as deep as this. Come on, Jimmy. Let's talk it out right now. What did I do and how am I lying? You weren't behind. You forced us off the road. How could he, young man, demanded Grandfather Holden. I don't know, but he did. Wait a moment, sir, said Brennan quietly. It isn't going to be enough to force him into agreement. He's got to see the truth for itself, of his own construction from the facts. Now, Jimmy, where was I when you left my apartment? You were there. And didn't I say? One moment, said Grandfather Holden. Don't lead the witness. Sorry. James, what did I do? You then a long pause. Come on, Jimmy. You shook hands with my father. And then? Then you kissed my mother on the cheek. And then, again? And then you carried my birthday presents down and put them in the car. Now, Jimmy, how does your father drive? Fast or slow? Fast. So now, young man, you tell me how I could go back up to my apartment, get my coat and hat, get my car out of the garage, and race to the top of that hill so that I could turn around and come at you around that curve? Just tell me that, young man. I don't know how you did it. It doesn't make sense, does it? No. Jimmy, I'm trying to help you. Your father and I were fraternity brothers in college. I was best man at your parents' wedding. I am your godfather. Your folks were taken away from both of us, and I'm hoping to take care of you as if you were mine. He turned to Jimmy's grandparents. I wish to God that I could find the driver of that other car. He didn't hit anybody, but he's as guilty of a hit-and-run offense as the man who does. If I ever find him, I'll have him in jail until he rots. Jimmy, pleaded his grandmother, can't you see? Mr. Brennan is only trying to help. Why would he do the evil thing you say he did? Because, and Jimmy started to cry. The utter futility of trying to make people believe was too much to bear. Jimmy, please stop it and be a man, said Brennan. He put a hand on Jimmy's shoulder. Jimmy flung it aside with a quick twist and a turn. Please, Jimmy, pleaded Brennan. Jimmy left his chair and buried his face in a corner of the wall. Jimmy, believe me, pleaded Brennan. I'm going to take you to live in your old house, among your own things. I can't replace your folks, but I can try to be as close to your father as I know how. I'll see you through everything, just as your mother and father want me to. No, exploded Jimmy through a burst of tears. Grandfather Holden grunted. This is getting close to the tantrum stage, he said. And the only way to deal with a tantrum is to apply the flat of the hand to the round of the bottom. Please, smiled Brennan. He's a pretty shaken youngster. He's emotionally hurt and frightened, and he wants to strike out and hurt something back. I think he's done enough of that, said Grandfather Holden. When Louis tossed one of these fits of temper where he wouldn't listen to any reason, we did as we saw fit anyway and let him kick and scream until he got tired of the noise he made. Let's not be rough, pleaded Jimmy's grandmother. He's just a little boy, you know. If he weren't so little he'd have better sense, snapped Grandfather. James, said Paul Brennan quietly, do you see you're making trouble for your grandparents? Haven't we enough trouble as it is? Now, young man, for the last time, will you walk or will you be carried? Whichever, Jimmy, we're going back home. James Holden gave up. I'll go, he said bitterly, but I hate you. He'll be all right, promised Brennan. I swear it. Please, Jimmy, be good for Mr. Brennan, pleaded his grandmother. After all, it's for your own good. Jimmy turned away, bewildered, hurt and silent. He stubbornly refused to say goodbye to his grandparents. He was trapped in the world of grown-ups that believed a lying adult before they would even consider the truth of a child.